So that's just a kind of a really quick overview, because if you're ever wondering when I'm talking about scripture, when I'm preaching, it's like, where is he getting that? That's a big piece of it, right? So that's just for all your edification, to get to know me a little bit more. So about this passage, I'll just point out a couple things that might be worth noting, and then take some questions, or to, just really kind of ask where you went with it. Again, this passage has a lot of parallels in other cultures at the time that this was written. The creation story, we talked about that last week. There are similar creation stories that were out there. They could have been compiled together. There were a number of different great flood stories around that time and place. The Epic of Gilgamesh is probably the one that matches our flood story the most closely, but they have a different conception of the gods or of God, which leads to this passage shows movement in terms of how the Hebrew people understood God as more monotheistic. So if we look at indigenous cultures globally, for the most part, cultures do not start with a monotheistic understanding of God. That is a development that happens over time. And this is one of the first great stories, great myths, where God becomes monotheistic, is in this Hebrew passage. So that would have not been the norm. So this is a new development when we get to this story. Remember, in the creation story, it's a lot of let us make humankind in our image. In this story, God is first person singular, speaking to Noah, right? So that's just a little helpful clue about something that's going on. The other thing, the reason why this is really interesting is because when you have a plurality of gods, then each one of them can have a different role, and they often have gendered roles. But when you move towards a monotheistic God, and particularly with the Hebrew God, male and female is contained within the one entity. That is a massive development that happened at that time, and is really probably the only one of that time. So as God develops from Elohim to Yahweh, it's that shift from plurality or an understanding of a divine council, and that is what constitutes God, more to a singular entity. And then, of course, angels and all that are developed later. We talked about this idea of a dome last week as well. This is some of my own thoughts around this. I wasn't able to do a ton of research around this. But why would people be so afraid of a flood, right? To create a story to sort of put fear in the people. My hunch is that while people are grateful for water to water their crops and for trading on the seas and all that sort of stuff, there was also this impending fear that at any point the dome could crack. If the understanding of the universe is that the sky is a solid thing and it's holding back the waters, that's what the firmament does. It holds back the other waters. You're surrounded by water all around you. If anything in that structure begins to crack, then the waters come in, right? And so then you have this interesting relationship between the gods and people about negotiating essentially a safe life where the waters don't take over everything. In like the Epic of Gilgamesh and some of the other flood narratives, those are often created by the gods fighting with each other. This story is different because it puts humans more at the front and center. It's about how humans are relating with each other and with God and their faithfulness to God. That's what brings the flood element into play. So again, that's slightly different. The last thing is the raven and the dove. This is has been a perplexing little element in this story for me for a long time. And I'm curious what your read is on that. Noah sends out the raven goes to and fro, and eventually doesn't come back, and then Noah sends out the dove. The dove becomes this really powerful symbol throughout Scripture and throughout Christianity. Brings back the olive branch. And then from there, they wait a little bit longer and are able to resettle. What do you think is going on between the raven and the dove?
Where did the raven go?
Where did the raven go?
Did he find some dry?
So, how many of you, well, I'll ask it this way, how many of you often think of ravens in kind of negative terms?
Oh, like crows.
Ravens and crows, right? This is one of those instances where interpreters have, in my opinion, been a bit lazy with the text and make certain assumptions like the ravens are black, doves are white, therefore ravens are bad, doves are good. Can you see how that would get us in some trouble with how we relate to one another even? Yeah. So there are famous interpreters who go that direction with it. But if you skip over what's the literal work of the language and the words, then you can jump to all sorts of places, right? And it can be a little confusing. Why is the raven going out and seemingly doing nothing, right? This phrase, the raven flies to and fro, like what does that even mean, right? Well, I'm gonna try my best to do this without butchering it. But that phrase in Hebrew, unceasingly flying to and fro, sounds like this. Wayesi yaso wasob. Wayesi yaso wasob. Do you hear kind of the rhythm of it? Even in the actual pronunciation of the words, there's a back and forth to it. Unfortunately for us, one of the verses that's left out of the vigil reading is a verse that says that the Ruah of God was moving back and forth across the waters that Noah and his family were floating on. The raven is going back and forth as the wind until what happens? Until the ground dries up. The raven is actually a metaphor for the Spirit of God. The raven is doing the work of drying out the land so that the dove can go and find land and bring evidence back to Noah and his family. Does that change the reading a little bit for you? Right? So that's just a little example of how if you can start with the literal and the tedious with the language and with the context, it can bring new stuff out for us. And so then both birds have an important role to play. The raven is not a throwaway. The raven is not the fool in that spoils the story, and then Noah has to go and get a dove and say, well, I'm gonna use the clean animal, right? Because they use doves for sacrificing, right, later on. Ravens were considered unclean animals because they were wild, not domesticated. But what do we know about ravens now? Same thing that they knew back then, but
They were super smart.
they're one of the smartest animals that we've ever researched. They can solve puzzles, they can do things that humans can do, right, without thumbs. So it's, it's a powerful element, and they're both really critical and important to the story. I'll stop there and stop talking at you and see what you noticed and what you wanted to ask more about. Fred?
Well, I'm sitting here looking at this hat because on the hat is a raven.
Oh.
This is the Pacific Northwest Native American, and he's carrying the sun in his mouth because the raven had to go and bring it back from the evil power. I can't remember what they called it, but because it was taking it from the people, and the raven goes and takes it back. And sometimes there's a long stories about how the raven had to do that in order to get that free back and bring it back to the people. So you'll see that picture sometimes in that, and always the raven has something in its mouth, and that's the sun.
Mm-hmm. There's a number of Native American creation stories. I mean, depending on where you are on quote unquote Turtle Island, which is how it's referred to by indigenous peoples. And a number of them involve the raven, who's the trickster, right? There's different trickster narratives. There's also coyote and fox. But raven, more often than not, is playing tricks on the gods in order to benefit people and the rest of creation. Whereas some of the other tricksters, their stories are often more about playing tricks on people, getting people to fight with one another. Just an interesting, I have a deep love of raven and those stories and crows, but yeah. That's why I have a big one on my arm. But. What else do you notice, or what do you want to find out more about or talk more about?
What's the timing issue? 40 years, 40 this, 40 that, all the numbers that the Bible uses.
Yeah, right. So the numbers are important. So 7 pairs of the clean animals, right? Whatever, however that shakes out and what that means. But yes, the 40 days and 40 nights of the rain, right? After 7 days, right? So there are these numbers of 7 and 40 that are significant. I didn't dive too much into that, but those are clues, right? When the same numbers pop up over and over and over again, it's a clue that there probably was no great flood, literally, that consumed the entire earth. And there probably is not a massive ark sitting somewhere up on a mountain that people are still trying to find. Archaeologists are still looking for this sucker, and I think I've heard that they found some pieces of wood in different places. I don't know. But the conception of the world was so much smaller than what it is now. But you can imagine living in a flood basin. Those kinds of things probably happened quite a bit, and they're trying to make meaning out of it. Why do these floods happen? Are the gods angry at us? What did we do to deserve this, right? So they're trying to make sense of these natural things that are happening. And so the numbers give us clues that, okay, this probably didn't actually happen the way that we think of reality, but it's probably connected to something that did happen, right? I would imagine. Maybe they just, maybe it's just completely made up. I was thinking about going back to that idea of a dome and always being fearful that it would crack, right? And all the water would come in or something like that. And I thought about the paddle that my parents kept on the wall in the kitchen. I don't remember it ever being used on me, but I remember thinking, God, if it does, it's gonna hurt, and so I don't wanna get in trouble. It's it's a little bit like that, where it's just like, okay, this is there. Have a healthy fear of it, right?
Looking at something more relevant, I mean, today, relevant time-wise, it's the, Alabama Supreme Court's definition that a zygote, or a, well, either one, embryo, is, made in the image of God, but a zygote doesn't look anything like I do, or you do, you know what I mean?
Right.
So what image is correct? I mean, speaking the rhetoric of this, what are we talking about? Is that something that would be worth a discussion? I mean, that's kind of, not tonight, I don't want to.
Yeah.
But
No,
I'm
I
just
think
thinking-
it is a relevant question.
And it just seems to me that it's a case of inventing rules by modern day models,
Right.
rather than having something based upon historical.
Yeah, and, you know, and I don't even think that there's a being out there that looks like me, like, that I wasn't created in that kind of an image. It's something else, right? It's that spiritual image that we're talking about. And just as a side note, in Scripture, the understanding of when a person becomes a person is when the Ruah of God comes onto the human being. So it's the first breath. That's when the soul, or whatever their conception of a soul was, that's when that becomes an integrated human being. Anyways, I think we'd be wise to learn from that theology as well. So, Margaret, then Scarlett.
I've always had a problem with clean and unclean animals.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'm not Jewish, so I'm not gonna say much about that. And of course, I mean, that goes back to sacrificial worship, which nobody has anymore. So that's a part of it. I mean, clearly, you know, Jewish people and Muslim people don't eat pork because there's something, you know, about that spiritually that seems off or wrong, or unclean, whatever that means. And that's gotten us in some pickles in Christianity with purity culture, but
Okay,
yeah.
now you can have Scarlett.
All right, Scarlett, last one, and then we'll start working towards being in small groups.
It's not in the scripture, but it's sort of between the lines that, God didn't just value the human family, but also the animal, and more of his creation.
Yep.
And said to the people, take care of my animals as well.
Yeah.
And I think as our Lord, they would be beautiful.
Yeah.
Thing for us to look at, is to take animals.
Yeah.
Didn't say take plants, but I guess plants would just make it on their own.
I mean, plants are the most resilient,
Yeah.
right? I mean, they come back the quickest after wildfires and after, you know, major natural disasters.
But the animals wouldn't have made it,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah,
But in the same breath, he says, be a steward to all of his creation.
right. Yep. That's a key element of this story, is about our stewardship of one another, and what I mean by that is all of creation. Yeah.
And the other thing I wondered sometime recently, thinking about it, is all of the fish and the life in the ocean had no problem. So,
Maybe, I mean, it depends. So when I was in college, I went to Mozambique, Africa, twice, and it was part of like a relationship with the college and some things like that. In between my two trips, there was a massive flood there, and several freshwater animals ended up in the ocean, and several saltwater animals ended up inland. And of course, almost all the saltwater animals died. But, you know, that was totally disruptive for them. So, if this really did happen, there could have been some of that.
Oh, sure.
Who knows?
Especially when it got cleaned up.
Right, yeah,
Everybody was in the wrong place.
yeah. And then we end up things like duck-billed platypuses. All right.
This story has always been a problem for environmentalists because at the end of it, where he talks about giving man dominion over the earth, and you move from, the plants being given to man and all the animals to man being able to eat the animals and the plants. And so sitting in classes, whenever if there was a reason for me to say that I was a Christian, they would leap all over me. My God, what is wrong with you? Don't you understand? This is where everything went wrong. Like, it wasn't this in the Bible that gave us the right to terrorize and to destroy nature because we were given dominion.
Mm-hmm.
Gotta look somewhere else.
Mhm.
Christian religion is what has done it.
Yeah.
And it's so, and I never liked it, but I was studied this with Father Fred last year and learned a whole different idea around God's dominion versus man's idea of dominion.
Right.
And it has changed how I see it, but it has always been a huge issue.
And dominion does not mean dominate. And I think that's, in an overly simplified way, is what got us in trouble. So, all right. So now it's time to break into groups, and Cheryl's gonna tell us how that's gonna happen.
I have an answer to your question. Think of the salmon. It has active sodium transport. It can live in fresh water and salt.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. That was excellent teaching.